and all the participants, all the members in the audience. It's my pleasure as a host. Yeah, a very good evening to all the speakers in this panel, all the participants in the audience. It's my pleasure to host this session on the theme of role of regulation for responsible AI. As we are aware, regulation of AI is a relatively new concept, and the implications of such regulation in a rapidly developing and advancing technology domain is yet to be understood fully. The importance of AI and other emerging technologies in a rapidly developing economy like that of India is fairly clear to all of us. We have set for ourselves the vision of taking the digital economy to the level of $1 trillion by 2024-25. That requires a massive transformation of the entire economic structure through infusion of digital in almost all sectors of economy and governance. That implies a prominent role for AI and related technologies in our economic development paradigm. However, a rapidly developing technology like that of AI also carries with it some risks of potential harm, which would need to be understood and mitigated through a balanced regulatory framework. It is fairly clear that the AI technology itself needs to be robust and safe, and the broad principles on which any regulation should be based should include inclusive growth, sustainable development, and responsible handling of data with privacy as a key principle. Data is the key raw material uh, which drives the development of AI and related technologies. In India, we have done fairly well in using IT in governance, in delivering public services digitally, and the private sector has also done well in developing IT and using it for various activities. Today, India is one of the largest consumers of data in the world. For dealing with personal data, we have drafted the Personal Data Protection Bill 2019, which is now in the Parliament for consideration. The non-personal data framework is also being drafted. With these two data handling frameworks in place, we hope to have the world's most contemporary data governance framework in India, which we hope will increase the development of responsible AI in India. I'm sure this session will be very useful in discussing the nuances of the role of regulation for responsible artificial intelligence with a star set of speakers who are well-known experts in their own fields. First, we will have the keynote speech by Mr. Brad Smith, who is the president and chief legal officer, Microsoft Corporation. Mr. Smith plays a key role in spearheading his company's work on critical issues involving the intersection of technology and society, including cybersecurity, privacy, artificial intelligence, human rights, immigration, philanthropy, and environmental sustainability across 56 countries. Smith is active in several civic organizations and in the broader technology industry. We will have a pre-recorded video. The message may kindly be played.
Good evening and namaste. I'm Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, and I'm delighted to spend a few minutes with you. The issues that all of you are considering in India and as part of this conference, I think are of fundamental importance, certainly to India, but really the world. And I wanted to spend just a few minutes offering a bit of a perspective on why I think that's the case. The first one is obvious. Artificial intelligence is advancing rapidly. It is changing the world all around us. In so many ways, it's creating new opportunities. It'll help us advance agriculture with better data and more precision agriculture. It will help us improve public health, as we've seen so clearly as we all grapple around the world with COVID-19. I think it can revolutionize virtually every part of the economy. And I think in so many ways, the countries that move the fastest to deploy AI more quickly than others will find that they will be accelerating economic growth. And I know that is what you all are already focused on and talking about in India. As we look to the future, I think it's fair to say that between now and, say, the middle of this century, India almost inevitably will become one of the world's AI superpowers. And I think that's a good thing for India, and I think it's a good thing for the world, especially if you all build on the conversation that you're already having in the country to create a national strategy, not just to advance AI, but to advance responsible AI in a way that's grounded in clear and firm ethical principles. I think this is the right moment, as you are, to come together and really define the future. We've been thinking about these same issues, as you all know, for the last few years at Microsoft. We have a team that leads our responsible AI efforts. It's a team that I have the opportunity to work with closely many days of many weeks. And I thought I'd take just a few minutes to share with you a little bit of what I feel we've learned over the last few years. I hope that what we've learned can be a benefit to you, and I hope you'll take everything that we've learned and build on it so we can learn from what you do to improve on this even further. In many ways, I think so much of this work begins with some of the recommendations that your own national report is considering. In short, it starts with a principled approach. I think that artificial intelligence really calls on us to ask first and foremost, what is the role that we want AI to play? And I think as much as anything, perhaps more than anything, it starts with the recognition that if used well, AI is not a competitor to the thinking of human beings or the work of human beings, but it's a tool that can augment and add to what we as humans can hope to accomplish in our lives. But to do that well, we need the kinds of principles that will ensure that AI serves people rather than the other way around. The kinds of principles that we've been focusing on at Microsoft are very similar to the ones that you all are now considering as part of national AI or responsible AI strategy. We decided to focus on 6. It starts with ensuring that AI is fair and unbiased. It needs to be secure and safe. It needs to protect people's privacy. It needs to be inclusive of everyone, including people with disabilities. And all of these, I've always felt, rest on 2 sort of foundational principles. One is transparency, because there's no way that the people of the world can or should trust AI if we don't have transparency about how it works. And then the last one, in so many ways, I think is the bedrock principle of them all. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that technology, in this case, AI technology, remains accountable to people, that there are humans in the loop. And it's about ensuring that the people and the companies that create AI remain accountable to customers, regulators, lawmakers, and literally the public in each country and around the world. I'm gratified to see that your own discussions are leading you in a very similar direction. Because let's face it, so much of the AI that serves the world will almost certainly be created in India. But as you think beyond the principles, as you already are, I think there are some other factors that are important to consider as well. As important and at the time as challenging as it was for us at Microsoft to develop our principles, in many ways I've ended up concluding that in some ways that was the easiest step to take. What is our current challenge is to operationalize these principles, to make them effective in our company, and I think the same thing will be true in any company, in any NGO, or in any government as well. And that requires not only the embracing of principles, but the creation of governance systems. It requires real work to figure out how to evangelize the principles, to train people so they understand what they mean, not just at a theoretical level, but for their day-to-day work. For a company that makes products or provides technology services, that means training engineers so that they're familiar with the scenarios in which these issues are likely to arise. And they have the tools at their disposal to put these ethical principles into practice. In many instances, it requires creating new technology tools, so that oftentimes we can test artificial intelligence before it's deployed. It's one thing to say that our AI will be unbiased. It's another thing entirely to be able to test a data set, to test an algorithm, to examine the output, to know that in fact it's working in an unbiased way. So all of this is really creating a new layer of work, if you will, almost a new area of specialization to make responsible AI effective. I also find increasingly that we then need to go even deeper. We need to build compliance systems in place, because if we don't have compliance systems, we will not have the confidence that in fact AI is working the way we need. It means reaching beyond our four walls, because one of the things I've often found each day as a technology company is that AI, unlike a number of other technology areas, doesn't work in some abstract manner. It works in a very concrete way as a customer deploys it. And while it might have worked one way with one data set, it might work in a different way when it's deployed with a different data set. And that means sharing what we learn with our customers and with people around the world. In a sense, we are all becoming AI enterprises. We're all becoming AI-based governments or AI-based NGOs or AI-based companies. And what that means is that these issues and principles around artificial intelligence are not for tech companies alone. We each are going to recognize that we have our own individual responsibility to implement them. The last thing that I would highlight is some of the incredibly important challenges that are becoming, if you will, the test cases for how AI will work. We think of these at Microsoft as certain sensitive uses. One good example is facial recognition. I think in many ways, facial recognition has become the first test case for the world. How are we really comfortable seeing facial recognition deployed? And one of the reasons that I think the work in India is of such fundamental importance globally is that I think these issues around facial recognition, for example, go to the heart of democratic freedoms, and it will be the world's great democracies that need to lead the way. What does facial recognition mean in a country or a world where we value freedom of expression, where we want people to have the freedom to assemble? Should we be comfortable with the prospect that people can be surveilled if they're peacefully protesting? We've concluded that we think that's a problem, and there should be safeguards put in place, including in the law, to ensure that government cannot use facial recognition in a way that would impinge on our most cherished democratic freedoms. That's just one example of the facial recognition issue. And facial recognition is just one example of a growing range of issues that we're beginning to have to grapple with around the world. We're thinking hard about what autonomous weapons mean for a future of military conflict. We're all having to think hard about algorithms and what kind of algorithmic transparency there should be to ensure that there is an inclusive economic recovery in the United States, in India, and around the world. And so increasingly, this conversation that starts with broad principles takes us to very concrete issues, and I believe even legislative debates. It is a global conversation. It's a global conversation where I believe India's voice needs to be heard. And of course, the first step in sharing your voice with the world is defining your views for yourselves. And that's where I think the National Responsible AI Strategy comes into play. Microsoft is obviously a global company. We have our headquarters in the United States, but we have long valued not just our relationship with India, but being part of the Indian technology ecosystem. Believe me, every day I get up and I'm proud of the fact that my boss, Microsoft CEO, Satya Nadella, grew up in India and combines that view of the world with everything he has learned as living in the United States as well. Because I think what it takes to serve the world is an understanding of how different parts of the world can come together. As we look to this decade ahead, there will come a point in 1 year or another when we'll finally put COVID-19 in the rearview mirror. But even as we get to that point, all of these issues around artificial intelligence will still loom ahead. These will be the issues, frankly, for the rest of our lives. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to be part of this event. Thank you for giving all of us who work at Microsoft an opportunity to be part of this great technology ecosystem. But most importantly, let's use this to commit to working together. Because I believe if we can bring the best of our ideas together, we can not only learn from each other, we can find the kind of path that the world needs, a path that advances technology but serves people and our fundamental values. I appreciate the time being with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Brad Smith, for your keynote speech. It's reassuring to learn that a global corporation like Microsoft focuses on accountability and keeping human values and ethical principles as the key focus areas in the development of AI. He also mentioned about the role of compliance systems as the key for development of responsible AI. And you mentioned about the challenges in the development of responsible AI in technologies like facial recognition, autonomous weapon systems. Your point about ensuring algorithmic transparency is, I think, a very important point as we try to develop a framework for development of responsible AI. Thank you very much for your speech. Moving on, next we have a panel discussion with a set of star speakers who are very well-known practitioners and experts in their own fields. First, let me introduce the moderator of the panel, Mr. Arghya Sengupta. He is the founder and research director of Vidhi Legal Services, with academic background as an alumnus of National Law School of India University, Bangalore, and the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. Mr. Arghya's areas of specialization are constitutional law and regulation of the digital economy. Dr. Sengupta has also served as a member of a number of government law reform committees, including the Committee of Experts to draft the data protection law for India. We also have Mr. J. Satyanarayana as a key speaker on this panel. He is currently the chief advisor of C4IR India, the World Economic Forum. He has, for over 40 years, held distinguished positions at the national and state levels with several feathers in his cap, including being the advisor to the Prime Minister Jan Arghya Yojana, Secretary of MeitY, that is the Ministry of Electronics and IT in Government of India, and Chairman of the Unique Identification Authority of India. He has pioneered several digital transformation projects for Government of India. Some of his commendable contributions include the National Digital Health Blueprint, which is now being implemented, having been inaugurated by the Honorable Prime Minister on 15th of August. He has also developed the India Enterprise Architecture, Digital Service Standards, and he continues to shape the policy and practice realms of deploying technologies in the public sector of the country. He has also contributed extensively to the thought leadership in tech spaces by writing several books that serve as valuable reference and toolkits for both academicians and practitioners. Next, we have Dr. Vineeth N. Balasubramanian. He is Associate Professor at IIT Hyderabad. With passionate leanings towards the research areas of deep learning, machine learning, and computer vision. Dr. Balasubramanian currently also serves as the head of the Department of Artificial Intelligence at IIT Hyderabad. His research has resulted in over 100 peer-reviewed publications at various international venues. His PhD dissertation at Arizona State University on the conformal predictions framework was nominated for the outstanding PhD dissertation at the Department of Computer Science. Next, we have Dr. Gulshan Rai. He is the former National Cybersecurity Coordinator. He holds an MTech and doctoral degrees and has over 35 years of experience in different areas of information technology, which include different aspects of e-governance, cybersecurity, cyber laws, and several related fields covering policies and operations. He was the first National Cybersecurity Coordinator for the Office of the Prime Minister of India. Next, we have Dr. Anand S. Rao. He is the Global Artificial Intelligence Lead at PwC. He is a partner in PwC's advisory practice. He is the Global Artificial Intelligence Lead and the co-sponsor for the AI Center of Enablement within PwC. With over 35 years of industry and consulting experience, Anand leads a team of practitioners who work with C-level executives at some of the world's largest organizations, advising them on a range of topics, including global growth strategies, marketing, sales, distribution, and digital strategies, behavioral economics, and customer experience, and statistical and computational analytics. As a global lead for AI, he is responsible for research and commercial relationships with academic institutions and startups, research, development, and commercialization of innovative AI, big data, and analytic techniques. With his PhD and research career in artificial intelligence and his subsequent experience in management consulting, he brings business domain knowledge, statistical and computational analytics to generate unique insights into the practice of data science. We also have Mr. Ralf Sauer. He is the Deputy Head of Unit, International Data Flow and Protection, and the Directorate General for Justice and Consumers of the European Commission. He is co-responsible for the entire work of this unit, which covers data flows both for commercial purposes and in the area of law enforcement cooperation. The objective of the unit is to facilitate such data flows through multi and bilateral arrangements at international level, including, for instance, the UN OPEC, Council of Europe, while ensuring a high level of data protection. It is also responsible for the European Commission's policy work as regards the international transfer tools provided in EU data protection legislation. That is adequacy, contractual instruments such as standard contractual clauses and binding corporate rules, certification mechanisms, and codes of conduct, so-called derogations. So with such a star speakers-led panel, I'm sure the discussion would be very interesting. And without much further ado, let me hand over to the moderator, Mr. Arghya Sengupta, to conduct this session.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kumar. Good evening, everyone. I think it's an incredible panel that we have, which is really interdisciplinary because we've got a set of bureaucrats, we've got academics, we've got practitioners and lawyers. So I think I'm hoping, as much as I hope you are, for a set of discussions that really is talking about an issue of regulation that is going to be critical to shape the future destiny of AI. Uh, at the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, where I'm the research director, our team led by Amin Johar is working to ensure that the use of AI in the legal and justice system is responsible, explainable, and beneficial to all stakeholders. Now, key to maximizing the benefits of AI and minimizing its harms is the appropriate role of regulation. Now, many of you would have heard yesterday's opening session where Mukesh Ambani, in his remarks, said that AI is indispensable for India's tryst with digital destiny. But the question we must ask ourselves is, what kind of destiny is that? Is it one of ruthless efficiency through automation without empathy, tolerance, and understanding? Or is it one of ease of living with human autonomy as its core value? As the Prime Minister of India had earlier said in 2018, and I quote, the road ahead for artificial intelligence depends on and will be driven by human intentions, unquote. And this is a point that Brad Smith also made in his earlier comments. So while AI has been a conversation in the making for the better part of the last century, it has undoubtedly come of age in the last decade. However, any development of science and innovation has the potential to propel humankind into unprecedented advancement. We can only think of, say, nuclear energy as a good example, or causing immense destruction. And I think nuclear energy would be a good example there as well. AI too presents a similar double edged sword. While it holds the key to truly transform human existence and societies, it is imperative to guide this process through adequate oversight in order to preserve our core values and human rights. This is where the role of the state, particularly that of the regulatory state, comes in. And that is the topic of our session today. So, as the moderator, my overarching question for all my panelists is this, that what should the role of the state be in ensuring that the development of AI is tethered to the public good? Now, we've heard Brad talk about all the positives of AI, whether it is in agriculture or it is in a range of natural language processing. One of the areas that I'd like to speak about very briefly before I hand over to the panelists is the work that we've been doing in relation to Indian courts. Like we all know that Indian courts have a massive backlog issue. There are too many cases in our court systems. But over the course of the last 2 years, in Indian courts, basic routine matters like traffic challans and compensation claims, which currently encumber and consume numerous judicial work hours, are being turned over to a computational algorithm. The algorithm is not taking a decision, it is assisting a judge to take a decision quickly. So, some stellar work in this direction has already been started by the AI committee of the Supreme Court with encouraging early results. So, there is tremendous potential that AI holds, but as Brad has already pointed out, there are several concerns as well. Now, I don't want to go into it in detail because I'm sure the panelists will, but just to give you an example, we all know about Compass, the most infamous specimen of such harm. It's a risk assessment tool that was designed and deployed in the US to determine the risk of repeat criminal offenders. Though, through a rigorous and empirical study of its training data sets, ProPublica published numerous papers showing how Compass was training on outdated data sets from the 1960s to 1980s. These were times of the civil liberties movement in the US, and a lot of cases were filed against African Americans, people of color, and ethnic minorities. Using this data set corrupted the Compass tool, reinforcing these prejudices in the present day parole system. So AI can also reinforce historic bias. There are several other concerns ranging from cybersecurity to transparency and accountability, all of which we will get to in this session. So, in this, it is with this perspective that the question arises before us: what is the role that governments have to play in maximizing the benefits of AI and minimizing its harms so that AI is tethered to the public good? Our stellar lineup will take up five facets of this topic. Uh, Mr. Satyanarayana, who I'll start with, will provide an overview on how to balance regulation and innovation. Vineeth will then focus on improving accountability and transparency in AI. Dr. Gulshan Rai, India's foremost cybersecurity thought leader, will talk about regulatory requirements of cybersecurity together with some technical issues. Dr. Anand Rao, with his immense experience, will talk about the role of governance in strengthening public private partnerships. And a key issue of privacy and data protection will be dealt with by Ralf Sauer at the end. I urge the speakers, in the interest of a good discussion, to keep their opening remarks to about 12 minutes to facilitate a tying together of strands at the end. There is also, I believe, an audience Q&A. So as members of the audience, you can send in your questions on the chat and they will be sent across to me so that we can take questions at the end for about half an hour. So that gives us enough time for opening remarks, a discussion between the panelists, and an audience Q&A. So, Mr. Satyanarayana, I'll turn to you now, given your experience as a seasoned bureaucrat for many years leading a number of tech initiatives of the government of India and the government of Andhra Pradesh. And the question to you is, where is that balance that regulation can strike between ensuring that the benefits of AI are maximized and the harms are minimized? Over to you, Mr. Satyanarayana.
Thank you, Arghya. I think this is the most difficult question to answer, most ticklish as well. And as you have rightly mentioned, AI is like a double-edged sword. There are benefits and there are also harms, and we need a fine balance. We need to strike a fine balance between these two. So more specifically, if I'm asked to list out the top 5 ways in which we can achieve such a balance, I would say the following. Now, the first one is adopting a system of agile governance for formulation of policies and regulations. Because as Brad was mentioning in his keynote, it is fine to have a set of principles, but the problem is when as they say, the rubber hits the road. So how do you implement all those, realize those principles in reality? So agile governance is a good approach to that, where it's not, agile doesn't mean a speedy governance, a faster governance, but in terms of collaboration with industry, academia, startups, and civil society is one way. Co-designing the regulations with the stakeholders and citizen engagement in every phase of development of the policies and regulations. And lastly, one suggestion is also for self-regulation. So a set of such ideas put together will be the agile governance. Is the first approach to achieving the balance. The second is creating a what is called a developatory sandbox. This is a new word that is coined, which is a hybrid of development and regulation. Developatory sandbox, where you can test out the algorithm thoroughly and its output and the quality of the outputs and the reliability of the output and so on. So that is one more session. Third is establishing a set of ethical standards and principles. In fact, in India, we have already started working on this, and the Niti Aayog, in association with the World Economic Forum, has come out with a set of AI ethics. So, which is a set of principles both on the technology side and also on the governance side. And the fourth suggestion in this regard of achieving a balance is to be able to, how do you know whether you have achieved a balance and where are you in terms of the balance? So it's best to create an index which can assess and monitor the balance. Where are you on the scale? Are you in the middle, or are you swaying to the right or the left? So it is like, one can call it, it's a balance between innovation and regulation, which we can measure it by ease of doing innovation. EODI, just like we have EODB for measuring the balance in terms of, the industry, ease of doing business. So we can have the concept of EODI, ease of doing innovation. So it's it's pegging at the right place, innovation, and not exceeding it, the responsible limits. And last point I would like to make in the area of the balance, striking the balance, is the concept of responsible by design. Just as we say security by design, privacy by design, we have to build responsibility into each and every step of the designing of the any product that comes out of AI or a solution. So early beginning, symptoms are of that can be seen in what is called the privacy protecting technologies, PPT as they call. I will give the example of Aadhaar. I had the privilege of being the chairman of Aadhaar for about 3 years, and Arghya, of course, you were with me at the time also. So Aadhaar, for instance, has improvised beyond the initial product to what is called virtual ID, and then also created another product called offline KYC. So I'm just giving it is more and more urged to protect the privacy in a stronger and stronger manner. So my suggestion is responsible by design is what we have to adopt in this area. And now one can say that AI is a nascent upcoming field and fast developing field. So how do you define the scope? So especially, defining the scope comes in terms of two dimensions. One is the legal dimension. The other one is for the government when it is procuring, or a company which wants to procure an AI solution. So let me deal with these two aspects. The scope aspects with reference to the scope of the regulation and scope of procurement. So first, what we cannot, can we write down a law which binds, defines precisely what does AI mean and what should it do, what it should not do, and what are the consequences of doing things wrongly, etc. So I think it's a bit premature at this point of time to define AI legally and precisely at this juncture for the reasons that I mentioned. And so is the case not only with AI, but several other, sister technologies, I would say, which are called broadly as emerging technologies like machine learning, IoT, blockchain, drones, AR, VR, MR, and biotechnologies. They all sit more or less in the same position as that. So it's very difficult to formulate a very precise law at this point of time. So how do you then go forward? So I think we should not be prescriptive in defining a law at this point of time, because prescriptive is identically equal to restrictive, constrictive versus constructive. So that's it should not be obstructive with reference to innovation. See, we should define the purpose very clearly, which should be for the common good of the society. Then the law should be molded around that intent and purpose. I'll take the example, very classic, beautiful example that is more than a century and a half old. The Indian Telegraph Act 1885 is a classic example where 145 years ago it was formulated, where it was meant to deliver telegrams or telegraphs. It's called, even now the act is called Indian Telegraph Act. There is no telegram, there is no telegraph for the last 20 years. When I was a child, I was seeing in the post offices people punching those single key keyboard, with a single key, punching the Morse code to send your telegram to the other side. So, but even now we are held, the entire developments in the telecom industry, starting with landline and radio and internet and data, 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, everything is covered even today by the Indian Telegraph Act. What does it show to us? Because the law was not prescriptive, it was, leaving enough degrees of freedom for innovation, of this century and a half. So it's a very good example for us to follow in the case of AI. Can we do something like that, which will survive and which will enable innovation to happen? So that's one suggestion and point I'm making here. In respect of law, it should be, a generic enough and should serve a long time. Second is, in terms of procurement, how do you define? Generally, AI, you can't define the problem in the first instance. So how do you procure? How does the department or the ministry procure an AI solution? When in the first instance, you can't define what you need. So you need to define as an alternative. You have to define the outcomes. What do you expect the AI to do? That should be defined very clearly, and you should also define what it should not do, any kind of harmful thing. So then the procurement, like for instance, the World Economic Forum again recently published a comprehensive framework, which is called AI Procurement in a Box, working with the government of UK. The forum has recently published that. So it brings out, the procurement process for AI solutions while maintaining the transparency of what is being done in the black box. Last point I would like to touch upon is, what are the key regulatory gaps currently at this point of time? So I would say that, we have to be clear to know the gap, what is to be regulated? What are we trying to regulate end of the day? So three things need to be should be the subject of regulation. The first one is data, with reference to way it is collected, processed, quality, bias, data sharing, and so on. Second area is about algorithms, with reference to whether it is designed for explainability, etc. Similar to DFT, Brad was mentioning about that, we should be able to explain what we are doing, the algorithm is doing. So the concept of design for testability, which is well established in the field of VLSI, is a well-tested area, design for testability. We should bring similar thing, designing all algorithms for testability is the second session. Third is in terms of, practices, the way it is probably something like ISO 9000, where an organization is allowed to define its own process, and the certifying authority will come and see whether you are complying with those processes. So the practices need to be benchmarked against such a framework like ISO 9000 is one session. So this is what I have to say. End of the day, to be or not to be, a question like that will arise. Why should we regulate anything? Basically, it is a question of ensuring that if it doesn't do any good, do no harm. To subserve that principle, at least we should have regulation in place, and I'm sure that we are proceeding in the right direction in India and globally as well. And really, it's a great pleasure and privilege for me to have been part of this event and also this session. Thank you, Arghya.
Thank you, Mr. Satyanarayana. I think that was a really comprehensive overview. I think I particularly liked the fact that we need to have an index, such as the ease of doing innovation index, to see how our regulations are actually faring. And I think you ended with what is the $1 million, or since we are in India, the $1 million rupee question, which is the fact that what is it that we are actually regulating? Because oftentimes regulation can be without purpose. So I think that actually segues very well with, and I'm going to take an executive decision as moderator, with what Ralf Sauer is going to speak about. And Ralf also has to unfortunately leave us in about an hour's time. So I thought it would be a good segue to have Ralf speak next on the role of data protection principles and AI, because one of the key questions that constantly gets asked, and I see it's already been asked by one of the audience members, is the fact that questions around data protection in AI are paramount. That how much data can you use, what can you collect, what can you use it for? And I think it would be very useful, Ralf, to hear from your perspective, particularly in the EU and elsewhere, in about 10 minutes, what you think data protection regulations around AI ought to be like, and where that balance between regulation and innovation can be struck. Over to you, Ralf.
Thank you very much. First of all, can you hear me? Yes?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. So good afternoon to you, Arghya, to my distinguished panelists, and to all those listening in. And apologies for sort of changing the order of things and having to swap. Unfortunately, I have another commitment later on. It is a pleasure and a privilege to take part in this panel, and I'm very grateful to the organizers for the opportunity. Perhaps a brief word on myself. I co-lead the department in the European Commission, which is the executive of the European Union that deals with international data flows and data protection, so all the international aspects of privacy. And it is in this context that in recent years, my department has been engaged in a close dialogue with the Indian government, as well as Indian stakeholders, on the draft data protection bill that India is discussing. And in my view, this work is indeed directly relevant for today's topic. In fact, in the European Union, we are currently having very similar discussions on responsible AI and the EU's future digital strategy. And these discussions start from the vision that the way data is collected and used must place the interest of the individual first, or in other words, the vision or conviction that the human being is and should remain at the center of policymaking on the digital transformation. And this is particularly true for the processing of personal data. And I would say, in fact, a number of principles that we believe are relevant for AI regulation were first developed in the context of data protection. You can see this, for instance, in the so-called AI principles that were last year endorsed at the G20 summit in Osaka, which contain elements like transparency and explainability that link to very similar concepts one can find in modern data protection regimes. And that includes also, for example, the possibilities for individuals to be able to obtain a human intervention, a review by a human being in case of decisions made on the basis of artificial intelligent processing. So we strongly believe that a high level of data protection is an essential part of this human-centric approach. And this is important from a perspective of the protection of the individual and his or her fundamental rights, but also we believe a central element of trust and therefore a competitive advantage for companies. And it's for this reason that we have followed with great interest the development of the personal data protection bill in India. And I understand that this exchange is timely as it comes at a moment when the Indian Joint Parliamentary Committee has just restarted its discussions on the bill and will probably very soon come with its report. As you may be aware, we have contributed on a number of occasions with written submissions in the public consultation process, and we continue to be in close dialogue with the Indian government on this important topic. And we believe this is now a great opportunity to ensure a high degree of convergence between India's data protection law and that of the European Union, which would greatly facilitate data flows between our two economies. And that is important because to build robust models at the core of AI-based systems, high quality data is the key factor to improve performance. And that is why the European Commission, my institution, is working on legislation to improve data sharing and the creation of data pools of high quality data. And I would invite you to look at our recently adopted communication on a European strategy for data, that's the title, that lays out in more detail the European Union's vision in this regard. And this includes the following elements, among others: creating a single European data space, a genuine single market for data, open to data from across the world, where businesses have easy access to a large amount of high quality industrial data, where data is secure and law can be enforced effectively. Creating common European data spaces in specific strategic sectors like health or mobility data for data analysis and machine learning. And this will be done in line with competition rules and requires addressing various regulatory and non-regulatory obstacles, including the market power of certain big platforms. Building a legislative framework for the governance of these European spaces with clear, fair, and practical rules about how data can be used in which situations, with rules on data sharing, rules on data altruism, so for individuals to allow the use of their data, interoperability requirements, and data governance mechanisms, for example, on things like usage rights for code-generated data, legal liability, IPR frameworks, and so forth. Another important element, opening up key public sector reference data sets for innovation. And all of this will be part of a broader industrial strategy on investments in next generation technologies and infrastructure to strengthen Europe's technological sovereignty. So things like supercomputers, cloud services, broadband access, and so forth, but also strengthening the digital competence of our people. So those are all measures that we hope can help to build up our artificial intelligence ecosystem and regain what has been termed digital sovereignty. But I wanted to stress that this is not about protectionism. It is not about data localization. The European approach is and remains one of being open but assertive, and that means that foreign players will be allowed and in fact invited to participate, but under the condition that they play by the rules. And ultimately, this is about ensuring a level playing field at a time when companies compete globally for data. And let me conclude with a few brief remarks, perhaps, on the specific AI work that is being carried out at the moment, and which is based on 3 pillars. First, ensuring that the European Union stays ahead of technological developments and encouraging artificial intelligence uptake by the public and private sectors. And that includes things like strengthening and connecting AI research centers, supporting the development of AI applications in key sectors, and so forth. Second, preparing for the socioeconomic changes that will be brought about by artificial intelligence, and that includes finding ways to attract and keep AI talent, offering training and retraining schemes for professionals, and more generally supporting digital skills and competencies. And last, ensuring an appropriate ethical and legal framework. And on this, and that's perhaps also interesting, the European Commission earlier this year published a white paper on artificial intelligence. And among other things, this white paper proposes various policy options for future regulation that would determine the types of legal requirements that apply to AI development and use, with a particular focus on high-risk applications. And in this context, the European Commission has published another communication on building trust in human-centric artificial intelligence, with a view to create the best environment and trust for successful development and use of AI. And the Commission highlights what we see as the key requirements for trustworthy AI, things like human agency and oversight, technical robustness and safety, privacy and data governance, transparency, diversity, non-discrimination and fairness, and accountability. And this process has already led to the elaboration of what we call an assessment list for trustworthy AI that translates these AI principles into a checklist for AI developers and deployers to self-assess their systems. And finally, I would like to mention 2 further documents that might be of interest, and that is the ethics guidelines for trustworthy artificial intelligence that were prepared last year in April, and the report on liability for artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies that addresses the difficult question of liability. So I would stop here. I hope this gives you a rough overview of some of the initiatives that Europe is currently pursuing to regulate, but first of all, to promote artificial intelligence uptake. And as I said at the beginning, data protection is a core element of this strategy. And so I hope that our dialogue on this, in this particular area, will continue. And I congratulate India for an excellent draft law, and I hope we will see its adoption very soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ralph. And I think that was a very comprehensive overview of what's going on in Europe. And I'm delighted to learn that the principles that you spoke of are being developed into some form of checklist. And I think that would be very useful, because the question that one often hears is that these principles are fine and we can all agree on them, or discuss them, but the real question lies in its implementation. So I think as that comes out, as in we would be very delighted to see what shape that takes. And I think the other thing that I really liked is that you spoke about the EU approach towards data protection as open but assertive. And I think that beautifully encapsulate what we were trying to do in India as well in 2018, where an assertion of digital sovereignty is not an assertion of out talking, is about playing by the rules of the game. And one of the key architects of that is with us. Pleasure of serving in the Data Protection Committee with his wealth of experience with cybersecurity issues, particularly, and an overall understanding of what practical issues one will face with AI. So, Dr. Rai, I turn to you to specifically look at questions on cybersecurity. At a time when AI bots are being used to spread disinformation, I recently read an example of how disinformation is spreading in Kenya before its elections through AI bots. Cybersecurity risks are clear and immediate. So, in your experience, what are the regulatory challenges and how do we think about regulation in relation to AI to ensure that cybersecurity remains sacrosanct? Over to you, Dr. Rai.
Thank you, Dr. Sengupta. Good evening, all my respected panelists, Mr. Satyanarayana, Dr. Sengupta, Mr. Anand Rao, Dr. Ajendra Kumar, Dr. Vineeth, and Mr. Brad Smith in absentia. I'm very glad that I am attending this this conference, the international conference, on the first very ground that the Ministry of Electronics and IT in 1990 started a UNDP sponsored project called a KBCS, Knowledge-Based Computing Program. And I happened to visit the alma mater of Rajendra Kumar, MIT, for that project, during that project. And one of my other colleagues, Mr. Vidhi Taneja, and some experts from the IITs and NCST, they were all involved in the project, and we were trying to create an AI-based system for the inspection of the steel sheets, rolling sheets, which come out of the plant. So I'm glad that I'm invited today, and I have the pleasure to say a few words, but relating to the security aspect. Dr. Sengupta and Mr. Satyanarayana has given a good background of the potential promise which the AI brings it on the table, and the issues have also been covered in some way. Those issues, I will little go beyond the certain issues. How do challenges we face when we look at the regulations or we try to frame the law? And Dr. Sengupta, nobody knows better than you, being a legal man, and you are doing the AI in the legal framework with the Chief Justice keeps on saying it, and the Data Protection Act. I have been privy to all what you have said there. The Honorable Prime Minister had said yesterday that there should be, he expressed certain serious apprehension on the AI being used as a guided weapon. And Dr. Sengupta, you mentioned the case of a bot in Kenya just now about that. There are many cases of abuse of the technology, particularly the AI, which has brought serious consequences to the world and to India also. And I can quote number of cases. And the first case I would like to mention, the case of a Cambridge Analytica. And in 2016, what happened there? It was all the AI, deep learning, data mining kind of a technology which was used, the ML kind of use. And we know the result, and we still talk about 2016, and the next election has come up. There are issues, there are reports coming up from the US that one country is supporting one, other country is supporting other one. So these kind of things are going on. the software are designed, customized using the AI algorithm and building the different kind of a technology into that to exploit the breaches, to exploit the system there. In India itself, I have seen number of cases there. And I can quote one of the very serious cases which were checked in time was the hijacking of internet traffic by a country. It went on for a few seconds to few minutes to few hours, and the hijacking went on 10 hours or so like that. The AI system checked the idle internal protocol block of addresses. They were broadcasted by a camouflaging to be a belonging to ISP in India, and entire traffic was routed there. The AI systems were so complex that our service provider were not able to detect the latency in the traffic for a minute or a half, that kind of thing, because normally you see the latency of 200 milliseconds to 280 milliseconds depending on the route which follow the traffic there. I can quote a number of cases. What happened, and the issue of the bot, Dr. Sengupta, you mentioned, issue of the bot as early as in 2007 Estonia itself was a manifestation of the AI aspect. Today, it is very common to see the algorithm self-replicating. Is the COVID-19 is not the replication of the technique which the AI uses in the cyber technology. Self-replicating, changing the entire characterization, changing entire manifestation. Same thing happened in the software. They annihilate themselves, they disappear, they are deep-rooted, and all is done by the using the AI and ML kind of applications there. These are the very serious implication, repercussions we have seen. Estonia, nobody forgets it. Everybody talks about it. And many other cases, US talks about it. Every other case one can see. They all talk about the aspects very vividly. We talk about it. Yes, every company has started now imbibing artificial intelligence when it comes to security. Today you get the firewalls or intrusion prevention system or a simple antivirus systems also with a lot of embedded AI into that. They do the pattern recognition, they do the behavior analysis, and try to do that. All your so-called the SIM, the security event management system, they're all having the AI blade there. So everyone is rushing, making huge investment in billions of dollars to incorporate the AI into the security perimeter security system or every security appliance there. That's what developments are going on. But who is ensuring those algorithms they behave properly at all times? We have the case of a driverless car in 2017 where the driver class it resulted in an accident there, creating a lot of people to die. We have I don't want to embarrass my friend Brad Smith, Microsoft chat bot, which turned out to be spreading the hate messages. Whole kind of a things happen there, and who knows, Muzaffarnagar incident and all kind of a thing we have seen there. So when the algorithms start behaving a good system, or when the algorithms start behaving a different kind of a system, how do you see that? How do you ensure that a company set up how the company designed and developed a software, but someone interject another software script called a shell and make it to behave different manner with a different AI application controlling from different. It's a common affair, common thing we see in the cyber world. We see that. It's easy to say that we must have the liability, we must have the design. I 100% agree. But let us see the difficulties. How do we go about it? And I don't agree with that. We can be more liberal in terms of designing the regulation and the framework there. Why should we liberal today after seeing so much devastation, so much damaging we have seen? Because the security issues, we started with only a simple virus. It went to some sort of a disruption. Today, the AI-based algorithms are causing the damaging and destruction. That's what we are in the face, and is all being aided by the AI. If a driver makes a mistake in normal driving a car, he is held responsible. If a car company, automobile company, provides a defective car, and then they are held responsible, and they call back all the cars there, and we have a number of cases there, why not be the person who is designing the algorithm made responsible? After all, it is well known to us that the internet is an open system. There are a lot of issues in the security. There are lots of issues in the governance system also there. It's all because the security was not kept. That's what Dr. Satyanarayana said. We must keep the security designed. So this is the right time when we are building, we understand the AI. Yes, it is the initial stage. We need to learn more. But we need to put in place right now the framework which should be scalable, which should be modular. As we move on, we should keep on adding the those kind of a provision, and it's going to be always going to be techno-legal kind of a scenario there. And we need to add the legal scenario as we understand technological issues and we understand the legal implications, that we need to do that. Imagine, had we not a TCP/IP 7-layer model, whatever security we have achieved by virtue of the different mechanism, either the process or technology, it would have been very difficult to do that had we not standardized the OSI or the TCP/IP model. Similarly, today also we need to look at it, how do we set the basic framework so that we achieve towards a scalable and a robust kind of a framework for a period of time. We cannot create overnight system there. So friends, I don't want to quote many of the cases there, but we need to look at what system there. Now, what are the issues which we are facing? It's easy to say liability. After the Estonian attack, it was found that we have not defined cyber terrorism. There is no accepted definition of a cyber terrorism there. AI can create a cyber terrorism. It can create it can result in the killing of the people. If some doctor is analyzing the images, doing some analytics on the data and prescribe the wrong medicine, the patient can get killed. It can create those kind of a terrorism there. So we need to look at it today, right in the beginning. We don't end up in a situation where we find lack of accepted definition of the cyber terrorism today. We should not end up in a situation that there is no uniform definition of the artificial intelligence. Mr. Satyanarayana mentioned about the contextual application or contextual side of the AI, because every regulation, of the regulation of the application need to be seen in the context there. A autonomous vehicle will have a different context. Autonomous intelligence system will have a different context. My warfare system with Intel AI system will have a different context there. Medical system will have a different context. So we need to create, first of all, a accepted uniform definition of AI. That's the first thing we need to create, and we need to interpolate with the cyber terrorism because it has a close linkages there. I'm glad that European Commission and many countries are doing a lot of work in terms of they are moving step by step in defining the basic regulation or basic steps. India also has taken a lead steps in defining, in moving towards creating a data ecosystem by drafting the data protection bill, which Dr. Sengupta was involved, and the report on the non-personal data. But we need to take it up. We need to see that the regulation we try to see, they are interoperable, as my friend from the European Commission has said. Maybe if we need to look at the data protection bill, because it's still in the parliament, if we need to add few more provisions the way we are talking about here, the transparency of data, responsibility of the algorithm. If we need to add the way GDPR has added, where They are made mandatory for a designer of the software or the service provider to show the algorithm if the user wants it, to demonstrate how they arrive at the decision by virtue of the algorithm. Why not we look at and do that? I mean, in the some of the basic things we can introduce right now.
Dr. Rai, just requesting you to conclude so that
yes, I mean, so as I will certainly support the what Mr. Satyanarayana has said it, but I think we need to first, Ministry of Electronics or the Government of India should form some group there. We must first look at the ethic principle which has come out during the meeting. We need to set up the ethic principle. Then we need to create a proper ecosystem, prioritize the issue, what they have to define. Then maybe we can put certain guidelines. At the same time, we need to create two facilities which has come up there. One is the exhaustive test system. One has to test the algorithm which comes there, and that should be independent body to test the algorithm, and at the same time create an independent standard, and we have to dovetail ourselves with the international community and then go for the final law, because it's going to be quite difficult, things. Set up the best facilities and create in the open AI platform. That's what we need to do for our security purposes there. Whenever we are trying to now formulate policy, we need to make sure that the open data policy, which the Government of India has said, it should scale up to what we are all discussing today, so that it can seamlessly be interoperable, whatever guidelines of framework we come up to. Thank you, Dr. Sengupta.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rai. That was a really useful practical perspective on what is needed and the roadmap that is needed for AI. And the role of government, as was rightly pointed out earlier, is not only as a regulator, but also as a facilitator. And I think that's a good segue to Anand, who will speak to us about the role of government in a different light, in how it can facilitate public-private partnerships. So Anand has a short presentation for us, so over to you, Anand.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sengupta. It's an honor to be here with this esteemed panel. I wanted to share just a few thoughts around the notion of public-private partnership, especially as it relates to AI governance. So I wanted to pick up 3 key points that I want to make. First is, we talked a lot about the trade-off between innovation and regulation. Yes, definitely we need to do that trade-off. And another idea that I want to bring in here, it's also about the economics of AI. So why do we want to regulate? There are certain inherent economic things that are different with data and AI, and that is why we should be bringing in the regulators, bringing in the public side as well as the private side. So that addresses the why question. The second point I want to drive home is that for a country like India, when we talk about AI, we have talked about a number of different types of uses of AI. And I want to focus, and India should be focusing on what is called human-centered AI. So let's carefully look at what can be automated, what can still be done by humans, and also where AI can augment what people are doing. So I would add that augmentation is where India should be going, given the wealth of people we have and how we proceed. And last, how do we make this public-private partnership not just profiting a few and creating that, what I call as the intelligence divide, just going beyond the digital divide, going into the intelligence divide? How do we prevent that from happening? So it's basically the why question, what question, and how question of public and private coming together. So with that, let me just address the first point, innovation and regulation. So it's very clear from all the speakers who have spoken before me, AI is big, right? So more than 84% of the people think that AI is fundamentally going to change the way we are working. But what is also surprising is the one at the bottom. More than 40% of the enterprises reviewed or surveyed are not addressing issues around risks. And a number of those risks just came out in our panel today. And that, I think, is really critical. So now let's look at what are those risks. And a number of those was shared by the committee. And the way we look at it within PwC and more broadly is these 6 types of risks. And what you see on the left-hand side, performance risks. Dr. Sengupta, you mentioned the notion around bias, and it happens everywhere, definitely in the prison system. And Dr. Gulshan Rai just mentioned about the security risk, the cyber security. There's a notion of control risk, so AI going haywire. All of these 3 types of risks, and a number of them beneath them, are things that the private sector should handle, can handle, with a little bit of a framework by the regulators, by the governments. What you see on the right-hand side, more naturally, it's some of the social risks, the ethical risks, the economic displacement, the economic risks. So these are some of those risks. Yes, the private sector should be involved, but society at large and also governments really need to play a big role to prevent some of those. So if you just leave it to the private sector, you might get a good sense of self-governance on the left-hand side, but not so much on the right-hand side. So if you just want only the societal one, then it's just the right-hand side. So you need to balance both the left-hand side here and the right-hand side. So that's what we look at. Now, I just want to pick one element of the economics of AI, and that is the network effect. So one of the network effects that's been very popularly known and shared in the Western world and elsewhere, I mean, it's happening in China, it's happening in India as well, is this what is called as the network effect. So what this really means is when you have a lot of data, and we just heard yesterday that in the panel, in the opening panel, that there are more than 600 million, 700 million cell phone users. People are connected to the internet. Now, with so much of data, what you really are doing is the algorithm gets better. AI basically works by sucking in the data, finding patterns, making itself smarter based on the number of people. So more data means more algorithms, which then makes the recommendation much better. So if there are more people using it and the algorithm gets smarter and it's much more personalized to me, the song I want to hear, whether it's a Bollywood song or a Hollywood song or whether it's a Carnatic music, it just sort of knows exactly what I want. And that value essentially means that more people come in. Oh, this is really cool. It just gives me exactly what I want in terms of my music or movies. So more people are adopting. Obviously, when you say more people, obviously that leads to more data. So what happens in this kinds of situation is, even there is a one single player, let's say India is a huge country, 1.3 billion, even if they just have 10 million customers and everyone else is smaller than them, very soon that 10 million customer company, if they start creating the AI, very quickly they can go around the circle, get better and better and better, and become really a mammoth company. And we have seen a number of examples of that. You can say, yeah, that's good, but in a sense, that also creates a certain sense of power in one particular company. There's also a related aspect, which has not been studied much by people everywhere, is this what I call as the cognitive network effect. So as I said, when a company starts growing and its algorithm or the AI is getting better and better, it gets more investment. People are pouring in money from the government, from the VCs. When you have more investment, what do? You go and hire the best brains from the IITs, from the BITS, from everywhere. When you have people, so the AI, in spite of being artificial intelligence, it's really dumb. It needs people to train it. So the better the people, so the more smarter the people, the better the algorithm. So not only is there a data network effect, the more people, the more experts there are, the more credit analysts you have, the algorithm gets better. And that's something that some of the big companies have been exploiting. So with smarter algorithms, obviously you get more value. With more value, you get more users. And with more users, you can actually reduce costs. And that leads to more investment. So you can see the cycle going on. And for a country like India, where not only do we have a huge population generating the data for us, we also have a very large number of people very highly educated. So that also can help us in this cognitive network effect that I think we as India should really exploit. And it's in this that we really need to get both the public and the private partnerships. The reason why I want to do that is, yes, we need to balance innovation and regulation, as some of our speakers have spoken, but we also need to clarify what fosters innovation. And I really like the idea that Satyanarayana mentioned about the index, the ease of doing innovation. So there are a number of ways in which you can facilitate innovation by clarifying the regulation. Autonomous vehicle liability, for example, testing criteria. Those are all ways in which you can start having more private sector investment because the public sector has come in and opened up and clarified certain things which are really murky in the AI world. And last, the reason I wanted to bring in the network effect, both the data and cognitive network effect, is we really need to regulate around the winner takes all. Otherwise, we will get into all kinds of issues of monopolies, and we should exploit the data cognitive network effect. So the question is, how do you do that, right? So we'll come back to that in a minute. I want to move on to the second one. So we addressed why the public and private should come together, or why the public sector should be involved. Now, what exactly should they be doing? What is it that we should be doing? So here I wanted to address automation versus augmentation. Here's a very simple framework that we have found extremely useful when we talk to our clients about what exactly should they do and where should they start. So let me just break this down. On one axis, on the x-axis, you see on one side, no human in the loop, and on the other side, you see human in the loop. And that is a very critical area. Are you trying to displace humans, or are you trying to get AI to help humans, right? So that's what determines you are on the right or the left. The other axis is how constant is your system, how hardwired or specific your system versus how dynamic things are. And again, I think Satyanarayana mentioned agile governance, right? So if the world is changing very fast, you need to be very agile, right? So you need to be much more on the bottom side in terms of adaptive. So now if you look at the types of intelligences that have come, or AI that has come, on this particular quadrant here, it's automated intelligence. So we don't want any humans in the loop. It is very hardwired. And I love the example that you gave, Dr. Sengupta, about traffic tickets, right? So it's a fixed sum. You know what it is, just get it done. Especially if there is a big backlog which is clogging the court system, that's the kind of thing that you can automate away. You really don't want people to be doing. So that's automated intelligence. If you go further here is the hardwired specific system, but you want the human in the loop. A bank manager or branch manager looking at the loans and deciding what loans to give or not give, they're assisted by the AI, but they still have the judgment. They can use the human judgment. That is assisted intelligence. And we have been using AI in this way for a long time now, at least for 20 years. And now what's happening with AI is in the assisted intelligence, humans are learning from the machine because it's smarter, it has crunched through all the data, and so I can learn where it is drawing the line for whom to approve for a loan. Now, what we are also seeing is augmented intelligence with machine learning, where the AI is learning from the humans. So let's say you have a loan officer in Mumbai who uses his judgment in a certain way. You have another loan officer in Chennai, she is using her judgment. Now you want that judgment to be similar, to be consistent. So you can have the AI learn the judgments of different people and then start normalizing and start giving back to you as to who is doing what, right? So that's augmented intelligence where the AI is learning. Of course, when the AI learns, we also learn, and this loop goes on. And finally, there's autonomous intelligence. We just talked about autonomous driving, and that's where you want these adaptive systems with no humans and no human drivers, for example, in cars. Now, what I would argue is, yes, there may be a limited amounts of automated intelligence where there are backlogs that we need to do in India, but predominantly for a country like India, I would claim that we should just be looking at human in the loop. Let's look at assisted intelligence. Let's look at augmented intelligence. Let's look at how do we pair up the human with the AI in a human-centered AI approach. So let's just focus on the what here should be assisted and augmented intelligence. So let's just focus our efforts there. And again, that goes with the cognitive network effect that I talked about. Let's use our people to develop better AI, and that developing that better AI will help our people, again, which will help us develop better AI, right? So we go into the cycle of people and AI getting better and better, very much on the left-hand side. Let's not go go too much on the right-hand side, and basically the cost of displacing a human maybe a few tens of thousands of rupees for a company, but the social cost for a country like India, or for any country for that matter, is immense, right? So let's not discount the social cost. Let's take that also into account when we do the automation. So one last point I want to make then is, so how do we do it? I address the why and the what. So how exactly to do it? Again, let me just draw some inspiration from work that has been going on. As Professor Sauer said, number of things happening in EU and UK. So this is by Nesta from UK. And one of the key things here is about how to do it. How can the private sector and the public sector come together to solve some of these issues around data, insights, AI? So just reading this graph here. So the two axes here is how much value can the public get out of any shared data? So that's on your x-axis, right? So in some cases, how many steps I do today, it's not of interest to the large public, right? So it's of interest to me, maybe it's of interest to my family, but beyond a certain small group of people, it's not of interest to someone. But the aggregated data in terms of in COVID-19, how much are people sitting in one place and not really exercising, that could be a very valuable insight at a higher level, right? So the personalized data is not always very useful. It doesn't have to be really shared by a lot. So let's just try and determine how much value we are going to get by data and the aggregation of that data across that spectrum. And on the other axis, how much control do I have over having to share that data? So if I share that data, can I get it back? Can I erase it? The right to be forgotten, which came from the EU regulation. So that's how you look at it. Now, that's all fine. That's a great framework. You have various types of data sources. Personal data tends to be at the bottom corner, and you have public data at the other end, where there is a lot of value in governments sharing their data. And there may be a lot of value in agriculture, for example, where each of the farmer or the field sharing how much of water they are doing, what they have planted, when they have planted, how much fertilizer they are doing, and that aggregate information by field would be immensely valuable to trying to track down and improve efficiency, what's called as precision agriculture, in a huge way in India. So how do we actually make that happen? So the ideas that are coming from different sources is we can create cooperatives. Now, we are very used to cooperatives in India, right? So dairy cooperatives have flourished. Now, this is a data cooperative, right? So everyone decides to pull in their data, and the more data you put in, the more you can take, right? So there's a data cooperative. Now, not everyone would be willing to share. So there are some cases where you need to create a trust. The government steps in, the public sector comes in, creates a trust, and then people can share their data. Finally, it can also create an exchange. I know the World Economic Forum is working on data collaboration for the common good, where you can start valuing the data, right? So it's an exchange. I can be an individual, I can be a company, I can say, I'm happy to give my data, but I want something in return. Create a data exchange, and everyone is clear, the government is clear on what the rules are, and people can share that data. So you can go from co-ops to trusts to exchanges and actually have a value. So have a value for data, and from there, the insights. So balance private control and public value, look at the profitability as well as the public cost, which is a key thing, and look at creating state-based and sector-based co-ops and trusts for India, right? So agriculture, dairy, there are a number of areas where we could create these kinds of trusts. So with that, I want to just close again, summarize. So from why we want to do it. So there are some very specific effects in the economic arena where the winner takes all. So that's why you need the public sector to step in. And also let's exploit the cognitive network effects and the data network effects to our advantage in India. Focus on human-centered AI with more of assisted and augmented intelligence, not necessarily automation or autonomous intelligence. Third, let's create public-private co-ops, trusts, exchanges, and the government can essentially set up the framework and the private sector can jump in to reap the benefits for the common good, for the public good, and it's truly AI for all. With that, again, thank you very much, and it's been a privilege and honor to be on this panel. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anand. That was a really useful breakdown of the why, what, and the how of regulation, because we are thinking of regulation as a monolith, and I think we have to break it up and ask ourselves these hard questions that you have. I'm delighted that you've come down on the side of we should regulate, as I think everyone seems to be agreeing on, but we should do so smartly. And I think one of the key areas for possible regulation is the question of opacity. And Brad mentioned in his opening remarks that accountability is the bedrock principle. And I think the question of the lack of transparency and accountability is a key question in the AI ecosystem. So we've saved the best for the last with Vineeth, who is, as an amongst us all, most technically equipped to talk about the technologies, given that that's his work every day at the IIT in Hyderabad, to talk about transparency and accountability to solve this opacity problem. So over to you, Vidhi.
Okay. Just, can you hear me? Yeah,
Yeah.
just one moment. I was trying to share my screen, but okay, looks like I'm having some problem sharing my screen, but let me just go ahead and share my thoughts as is at this time. Thank you very much, Dr. Arghya, for coordinating this session, and thank you to all the panelists for the excellent thoughts so far. So probably my role is a little orthogonal to the several thoughts that have been shared so far. So, and what I'll try to do here is to share my thoughts from a technology perspective. So I'm an academic. I work as a faculty in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at IIT Hyderabad. And my research areas are in AI and also explainable AI. So I'll try to look at this from a technology perspective and share some of my thoughts to add to what has been said so far. Specifically, I'll try to talk about what is being done, what can be done from an academic research perspective. Of course, I think we live in a very interesting world where academic research and industry research are very closely tied with each other compared to what happened in previous decades. And I'll also try to talk about what needs to be done and how can we work together, both the technology side and the regulatory side, and of course, all other aspects that need to be taken into account to actually bring this into a reality. So the role of regulations in AI from a technology perspective can be highlighted through the example of European Union's GDPR. I think that was passed a couple of years ago. And one of the clauses of the European Union's GDPR Act says that a business using personal data for automated processing must be able to explain how the system makes decisions. I think this was in Article 15.1H and Recital 71 of GDPR. And what is interesting about this regulation is in the past, technology, especially if you looked at, say, academic research, it always happened in its early stage. It took a while to mature before it got transferred to the industry. And then once it matured to a certain extent, regulations came in place on how it should be deployed and so on and so forth. Things were generally done in a sequential manner, but we live in very interesting times where everything is happening almost at the same time. While the foundations of AI that we use from a technology perspective today are decades old, a lot of developments that are relevant for our applications today are still being developed each day, both in academic labs as well as in industry labs. And this particular GDPR Act that was passed a couple of years back about being able to explain how a system makes decisions was an interesting case study of how the regulation instigated researchers now to start ensuring that they have models that can explain their decisions. I think it's a nice example for how the two can work together to be able to deliver solutions that can be useful to the broader population. So what is the academic community or the research community broadly, both academic and industry, doing in this space? Very broadly, the keywords that the community is operating on is known as FATE. At least this is one acronym that people go by: fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics. So this has been a mantra for many people working in this field. And in fact, the entire research community today has a conference called, this is organized by ACM, the Association of Computing Machinery, which is a very well-known organization, which is also responsible for giving out the Turing Award. So that there's an ACM conference known as FAT, which stands for Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency, which brings together researchers around the world, as well as social scientists and other related areas to come together and talk about these issues and help develop models, as well as help develop data processing methods and data storage methods that address these requirements towards responsible AI. I think that's one of the core things that's been happening over the last few years. So another way of looking at the entire space of research in AI ML is AI ML is not really new. It has been around for the last few decades, in fact. Right? So AI ML has been used. So, I mean, we took the example of Brad talked about the example of face recognition early today as a good test bed for responsible AI. Face detection was in point and shoot cameras 15 years ago. If you owned a point and shoot camera 15 years ago, you actually had a face detection model. Why didn't we talk about these issues at that time? Why is it more important now? So if you had to characterize the success of AI machine learning applications so far, right, you could talk about what is the product relevant to the user, what is the sentiment of this tweet, what are the objects in an image, so on and so forth. In most of these applications, the cost of a bad decision is low. A bad movie recommendation, you perhaps lose 500 rupees in 3 hours, you don't lose a life. However, I think the conversation about regulations on AI today has become important as AI enters more complex real-world systems, especially risk-sensitive systems and safety-critical systems. I think Anand just spoke about the various risk factors that these AI technologies impact. And as AI solutions start getting into these kinds of products, it becomes even more important to talk about regulations on AI. And what characterizes these applications? The cost of a bad decision can be extremely high. So even today, I think AI ML does have applications where maybe the cost of a bad decision is not high, but that's the main characterization that has changed the conversation today to talk about these kinds of issues around AI. So I'll just take 2-3 minutes to talk about what is being done in the research community, a little technical, but I'll keep it high level. Is very broadly speaking, the technologies that are being developed for especially explainability, right, which is related to accountability and transparency that's required, as we all discussed so far, is very broadly these methods can be developed, divided into what are known as post hoc methods and anti hoc methods. Post hoc methods means you develop an AI ML model, and then once you already have the model, then you add a layer of whatever you like, explainability, trust, accountability, ethics, whatever it be, right? And that's the simplest thing to do. And that's what most people are doing today if they are forced to deploy explainability in their applications. On the other hand, what we need are anti-hoc models where explainability, trust, all of these aspects are baked into training the model itself. This is a harder challenge. This at this time is still, you do have it in certain AI and machine learning technologies today, but still is a challenge to be able to develop that as part of learning a model itself. There are other categorizations like model agnostic, model dependent, global, local, so on and so forth. In global methods, you're talking about accountability and transparency at an entire data population level, whereas at a local explainable models, you're looking at explaining an AI model for a specific person when you're making a decision on one specific instance. So there are some variations based on which obviously the regulations have to take into account these kinds of variations in the algorithms. Let me take a few minutes to talk about some of the things that we have been doing at IIT Hyderabad, and I think that that probably relates to some of the discussions that we've had so far. One of the aspects of explainable AI that we've been looking at is trying to integrate causality into machine learning. So if you want accountability, at the end of the day, you need to know what caused an outcome and not what correlated with an outcome. So, I mean, I could give a medical example for this. Let's say a patient is at a risk for a heart attack. Maybe whenever a heart attack occurs, the BP is elevated, but it doesn't mean that an elevated BP caused the heart attack. So this you could extrapolate to many other applications, that accountability depends on what caused an outcome. However, existing AI machine learning algorithms are largely correlation based. So whatever data you give, any correlations that exist in the data, it captures them and makes their decisions. So which means, as I think most of the panelists said, the algorithms themselves also have to be developed to keep in mind these regulations that need to come into place. And causality is a very important dimension of this analysis, because it's important to be able to say which input caused an output rather than was simply correlated with an output. Another aspect of research that we've been looking at is the transparency aspect that we just spoke about, which is about, in specific, we have been looking at doing this with computer vision tasks. For example, you could talk about trying to explain how a decision was made on a chest X-ray to categorize a patient as COVID positive or COVID negative. On one hand, you could have a machine learning model that looks at a chest X-ray and says that a patient is COVID positive or COVID negative. But ideally, what we are looking for is how much trust can a user have in that model. And one such method that we have developed, which is actually being used by researchers around the world today for explaining COVID decisions, is which part of the image was the model looking at while it gave that decision. If it looked at the corners of the image while it gave that decision, the radiologist or the user interacting with the system may not really be able to trust that model. So how do you bring that transparency? We have developed some algorithms for these, which, as I said, are already being deployed around the world. So that's about transparency and accountability. And I also like to touch upon one aspect of algorithms which perhaps was not covered in the discussion so far, which is we talked about accountability, transparency, so on. AI and ML today is largely data-driven, right? And that's the reason why biases in data directly impact the model, directly impact the outcome, and directly impact people. The way humans make decisions is not data-driven. We also use our domain knowledge, the background knowledge that we have gained from childhood, and our common sense reasoning. We simply don't go in a data-driven approach. So how do you integrate these aspects of common sense reasoning, background knowledge into what today are data-driven AI systems is an extremely important direction of research. That's also something that we are pursuing at this time. So it's not just our group at IIT Hyderabad. I think around the world, there has been a lot of conversation in the AI machine learning technology community about fairness, explainability. We also have various institutions in India, including the IITs, IISc, institutions such as Microsoft Research, IBM Research, LinkedIn, Accenture, that have been explicitly putting in concerted efforts on trying to bring in fairness and explainability in their machine learning models, detecting fake news, detecting deep fakes, so on and so forth, each of which is an important technological element to go towards responsible AI, and which also perhaps contribute towards the regulatory efforts. So what then needs to be done from a technology perspective? So the fundamental formalizations of AI ML have relied on input data and output prediction. Right? That's how the fundamental mathematical formalizations have been developed. How do you revisit these formalizations to keep in mind the requirements for explainable, fair, responsible AI? And the entire formalization perhaps has to change to address these kinds of challenges around the world. How do you balance trade-offs? Often a big challenge for, I'm quite sure this is true for industry as well as academia, is when you try to make a model more interpretable, more fair, it often starts dropping down in accuracy or performance. So how do you maintain this trade-off? You ideally want an interpretable model, a fair model, a responsible model, but this could mean a trade-off in accuracy. So what would you like in a given application? In a particular application, maybe a 99% accuracy is what counts. But in a certain other application, maybe a 90% accuracy with interpretability is what counts. And this could change based on what you're applying your AI/ML model to. A third question here, which is actually extremely important, is how do you evaluate these systems, right? And I'll come to this point in a little bit more detail very soon. And I'll leave this point for a minute later. And even if you could evaluate an explainable system and you've developed an explainable AI model, who owns the explanation? So I talked about most methods that are in practice today are post hoc methods, where you develop an AI ML model, develop an AI ML system, and then you add a layer around it for whatever you'd like it to achieve, whether you'd like it to be fair, whether you like it to be explainable. Typically, you add a layer around it to be able to do that. Now, if something goes wrong in either the outcome or the explanation or whatever related rationale needs to be given for that particular end user, who owns the explanation? So now there are two components that you're putting together. Each one of them obviously is going to point a finger to the other. Who owns the explanation becomes an important part of this discussion. And that's the reason why anti-hoc methods, where you build all of this into the development from scratch of these AML systems, becomes important. And I think from a technology perspective, for people listening in with a technology background, I'd also like to add that going back to history, AI has broadly been divided into what is known as symbolic AI and connectionist AI. I think this entire space of having a responsible AI system, having a transparent AI system, having an accountable AI system, actually provides an opportunity to bring together these symbolic systems and connection systems. Symbolic systems rely on things like logic and so on and so forth. So how do you have a model or a system that can give high accuracy, as well as can give out some logic in its decisions and be based on a set of rules or guiding principles that constrain its functioning? To conclude, I just want to point this out. The entire AI ML pipeline is a very simplistic pipeline if you look at it. You have data, you feed this into AI or machine learning algorithms, and you get an output which you measure using performance metrics. Right? This is the simple pipeline. You have data, AI ML algorithms, and performance metrics and evaluation. At the end of the day, AI ML algorithms learn what is given in the data to maximize a performance metric. Right? At the end of the day, this is all what the mathematical formalizations of AI ML algorithms do. So where can regulations really fit into this picture, into this pipeline? If you leave aside the AI ML algorithms, the data on one hand, which is what I think everybody is talking about, you need to ensure that the data doesn't have biases, ensuring that your data has all of these preferred properties. But another aspect that's extremely important is also ensuring that there are clearly defined performance metrics for evaluating these AI ML algorithms. If you say accuracy is all what you need for the AI ML algorithm performance, then that's all it'll learn. That's what these AI ML algorithms are designed for. So if you have performance metrics that are defined for explainability, defined for fairness, defined for ethical working, then the AML algorithms automatically conform to this definition. And I think that goes back to many of the points that have been shared by all other panelists about having a sandbox or a test bed that clearly algorithms. So I think that ensuring that the data is well regulated, but
Vineeth, you need to conclude now, please.
To maximize, clearly defined, to address the requirements that we need is extremely important. Important to realize that the evaluation or performance metrics, if a method or an AI system for one user could be different to what it means for another user. So I completely agree with what Anand said about having human in the loop systems where the evaluation also involves.
Sorry, Vineeth, you'll need to conclude now, please. Thanks. Okay, I think there is. Sorry, we are having some trouble with your connection, so we can't hear you very clearly. But I think we got the gist of what you were saying. And I think that was excellent. That I think this was really a picture from the ground in terms of what's happening, and what you ended with, that we need to think about regulating both the data and the performance metrics, is great. We've got about 10 to 15 minutes, and we've got some great questions from the audience. So instead of asking mine, actually, I'll just go straight to the audience question. And I think one question from Shrestha Gatani is actually very one that I'd like to ask as well, which is that she's talking about the fact that we are, after all, designing regulations for the next 500 million. This is consonant with what the Niti Aayog is also saying is AI for all. Given that that next 500 million currently is not digitally literate, does not have the smarts to realize what is going on with their data. Mr. Satyanarayana, I'll put this to you. How are we going to think about this regulation, particularly in terms of putting the citizen at the center of this growing AI ecosystem? Do keep your answers short so that we can get a few questions.
Yeah, thank you, Arghya, and good question. I think it's quite relevant for India to answer this question properly, address it. I think it depends on the kind of use case and the theme that we select to work on and the priority. For instance, agriculture, take the case of agriculture, where we have majority of the farmers being small farmers. So if it is an AI use case which is useful to the farmer directly, automatically we are addressing the question of equity and distributive justice there. So AI for all, to that extent, will be will have to be considering what kind of use cases are you going to select. So it depends substantially on that.
Certainly. Anand, since you had mentioned that humans in the loop is what we should be thinking about, the left-hand side of your quadrant, I was wondering whether you had thoughts about the fleshing out your how question. That how do we regulate? Do we think about making the state thinks in its sort of parents patrie role, as we say in law, as it's regulating on behalf of the citizens, or are we thinking about mechanisms based on consent and individual autonomy?
Yeah, I think it's a combination, right? So in one sense, yes, the governments need to take the facilitating role, but you have a number of organizations, societies, not-for-profits, all carrying a piece of the voice, right? So not everyone will be representing the entire nation. But if you go, as Satyanarayana was explaining, so take farmers, I mean, they have a group, right? So let's just go find out what are some of those things that they have as concerns. Various areas of society, whether it is administrative, service-oriented, tech-oriented, farmers, or just casual workers, each one of us have something or the other. And again, tying back to the earlier question, I think AI needs to be brought down to the common person, right? So it's not this thing that we have this view of HAL or an autonomous vehicle and that's AI. It's very simple things. When your cell phone says when to irrigate your farm or how much to irrigate, that is AI underneath, right? Or even in the entertainment sense, hey, this is a cool song that you would like, given all the songs that you have heard, that's AI behind. So just make that visible and then get the people of various forms to just sort of start doing that, but with the help of the government, right? So the state and the
And I think that's a useful tip for Dr. Rajendra Kumar and Meeti, that I think with any form of regulation, digital education and literacy is very critical if it is going to play a role. So Dr. Rai, there's a question from Tuhin Batra. Since you spoke about Cambridge Analytica, he's talking about Social Dilemma, which we've all recently watched on Netflix. And the fact that people sitting somewhere can determine what we see and what we get, and which has grave impact on mental health of people, particularly when it is not even done by people and it is done by bots. So he's asking, perhaps a little cynically, that how can we even regulate this space? So what is your sense? I think that's a question that a lot of people have.
Hey, Dr. Sengupta, you see, I mean, that's why I said it. it's easy to say we must fix responsibility, accountability. But in the AI area, it's very difficult to do that because our understanding still has not come to mature. I'll just take a minute coming to the previous question, but the lady asked that. You see, the liability and accountability will depend upon several factors. There is a problem in my algorithm. There is a problem in how I use the algorithm. You see, how I use the application. But a farmer is not educated where, it is said that training is partly required. How the error is introduced by the device where I am loaded the application there. So there are different ways. It's become very difficult in a virtual world to determine the accountability. So is the case with the social media. We have not been able to account for the present data protection. Okay. See, now look at the GDPR case, which our friend from IIT Hyderabad said, and the European Union said. It's 2018. 2018 we implemented GDPR. Have been able to enforce that the entire my algorithm it had to be demonstrated the way I arrive at a decision. It's very difficult to do that. We need to understand better. I don't think anyone have a ready-made answer to do that to both the questions what has been asked there. That is what we need to learn more, and that's why I said we need to go in a scalable form there. Understand, change it. There is no uniform formula. And then geopolitics, Dr. Sengupta, the geopolitics. What could you do with the China with the COVID-19 case? The data is not coming. What is the issue? Is the geopolitics of data. So I think there are issues. We have not been able to finalize the norms of behavior going from 2000 to 2020 now. So these are the issues which has to be well thought of, well debated. I don't have any answer to our friend, the lady, but these need to be answered.
That's right. So I'll take that to Vineeth, because I thought you made a very interesting point at the end about both regulating the data and regulating performance metrics. So while we've spoken a bit about regulating data, my question to you about performance metrics is, can we really regulate performance metrics except at a very abstract level? Because obviously there would be different use cases which will necessarily have different performance metrics, and accuracy is not a bad performance metric to have. So what is the level at which we are thinking about regulation of performance metrics? If you could very briefly flesh that out for us, please.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Arghya. I think that's a nice question. I think it fundamentally goes back to how data is created and shared with the AI/ML community for working with it. So if a data set is created only with an input and an output, the only performance metric that you could have is accuracy. But if data is created with input, output, and an explanation, now you could have how true is the AI/ML algorithm to a particular explanation. So these performance metrics obviously will change for every given application, but it needs to be defined. For example, if you want your output to be transparent, you need to define what transparency means, what faithfulness to you obviously have to be faithful to something, what faithfulness means. And if you want your entire system to be ethical, you need to define what ethical means. As I was mentioning, most AI/ML algorithms fundamentally are optimization engines. They try to optimize a metric given some data. So that metric needs to be clearly specified if an objective has to be achieved. It's
Great.
not an easy answer, but that's the broad.
No, I think that helps. I think there's a lot of work to be done in this direction. So I think we have time for one more question. And I think
no, Dr. Sengupta, if you just give me a few seconds to add what our friend said. The performance, there's another factor on which will influence the performance metric is the size of the data. You see, quality of data, that will certainly change the performance metrics. So, I agree with our friend. It's not going to be that easy to, actually, if we have to define what is the performance matrix in the legal term, tomorrow you come up, what is the performance matrix? It's going to be too difficult part. It's easy to introduce the concept, but difficult to think in terms of regulation. Either way.
That's right.
Thank you. Thanks for giving me that.
Yeah. So the last question, and I think it's an interesting one to end with, from Mayank Suri. And he asks, should AI really be employed in every aspect of human life? If you were to choose one sector each where it should not be used, what will that be and why? So everyone, if you could choose one sector each where you think it shouldn't be used, or an area where you think we should be cautious, I'll put you on the spot first, Mr. Satyanarayana.
I think where there is a risk of human life, I think that is of highest consideration to me, the highest risk one can think of. So we should not deploy there.
I think that's a useful principle. Anand?
Yeah, I would say life and wealth, right? So if there are very critical decisions, then the human should be involved. Not that you should not use AI, but a human judgment should be exercised in the medical field, and it's also in the financial sphere where you're investing money.
Right. Okay, that's another useful principle. Vineeth?
I too agree. I think it's not about completely not using it or using it. I think in risk sensitive settings where human life, property,
We're losing you a little bit, but I get a sense that you're speaking as a good technologist that perhaps we shouldn't take a one size fits approach, and we should think about where we use it and what the reasons for not using it are. Dr. Rai, last word to you.
My recommendation is that we must use we may start using AI, which helps in assisting you the decision, not as a decision. It should assist you the taking the decision.
That's right. No, and I think that's a very useful principle to end, which echoes what Anand was saying earlier, that we need to be on the left side of the quadrant rather than the right side. So I think we've had an excellent session with lots of diverse viewpoints, which we always get in an interdisciplinary panel. It's hard to summarize it, but I think if there were 3 key takeaways, I think there's a broad consensus that A, we need to regulate. It's not that we need to think about regulation as a bad word, but we do need to regulate. Number 2, we need to monitor this regulation so that A, it remains dynamic and doesn't remain static, and B, that it assists decision making rather than replaces human decision making. And number 3, that we need to co-create between public and private and think much more about how to keep the citizen at the center of this ecosystem. Because at the end of the day, it is not AI for the government of India or the IIT or Microsoft. It is AI for the common person, the farmer, to make his life easier, and for the daily wage laborer to make her life better. So at the end of the day, that's where we need to keep our focus. There are no easy answers, but certainly lots of questions and lots of food for thought. I thank the panelists very much for this wonderful session and hand it back to Dr. Rajendra Kumar for his final words.
Thank you, Mr. Sengupta, and thank you all the speakers on this panel. It was a stellar discussion, to say the least, from my side. I think all the points made were very relevant. There are many pointers when we think of regulation in the AI domain for my own department, that is the Ministry of Electronics and IT, which we would like to really deliberate upon and in the time to come. I think the key points which form the bedrock of any regulatory framework which came out from this discussion are the areas of transparency, accountability, fairness, ethics, and ensuring that on the whole, the framework has to meet the test of responsibility to society as a whole, with citizen at the center, as was mentioned by several speakers. So on my behalf, on behalf of the Ministry of Electronics and IT, on behalf of Government of India, I would like to convey my sincere thanks to all the speakers, to the moderator for this discussion, and to all the participants who stayed up till this time to really ask so meaningful questions. So thank you to everyone once again. Thank you. We'll conclude the session at this point. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.